Hello, everyone, and welcome. I would like to welcome you to the third and last seminar of the interdisciplinary seminar series of the Fordham Research Consortium on Disability. So for those of you who are not familiar with the consortium, I'm going to include in the chat a link so that you can have more information. I'll do that in a moment. For now, I'll give a brief introduction of our speaker. So we are delighted to have Lauren Toppenberg give a talk on food insecurity, disability, and access to multiple social welfare programs. So Lauren is a PhD candidate and researcher at the Columbia University School of Social Work, and her research focuses on the intersection of household well-being and social and economic policies with an interest in understanding how the social welfare system impacts food insecurity for households with disabilities. And we are delighted to have Dr. Zach Morris give comments on Lauren's paper. So Dr. Morris is an associate professor at the Stony Brook School of Social Welfare, and he conducts policy-relevant research on the financial and social inclusion of people with disabilities. So Lauren, you have the floor. Thank you so much for being with us.
Sure. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here. Thank you for having me. I'm here to present the preliminary results for one of my dissertation chapters entitled Exploring Disability and Social Welfare Participation Through the Lens of Food Insecurity. So I just want to acknowledge that part of this research is funded by SSA and the University of Wisconsin Center for Financial Security, but all interpretations and mistakes are my own. So just a brief overview of today's presentation. I'm going to start off with a short background on disability, social welfare, participation in food insecurity, and I'm going to introduce my research questions at the end. I'll then move on to cover data and methods, and then go over preliminary results and wrap up with a brief discussion. So I'll just jump right in. So intuitively we know that households with disability have a unique relationship to the social welfare system. Research has found that households participate in higher rates of specific programs within the social welfare system, such as SNAP, as well as in higher rates across the collective system of social welfare programs in general. Moreover, there's often a unique eligibility for some social welfare programs based on disability status that's not afforded to other groups, including SNAP and Medicare, as well as programs that are solely for people with disabilities, such as disability insurance. Households with disability also have a unique relationship with food insecurity. So even after controlling for financial resources at the household level, households with disability experience significantly greater rates of food insecurity than households without disability. Food insecurity is a multifaceted lens through which to explore gaps in well-being for households with disability. It has the ability to capture a broader status of well-being than other traditional economic measures, such as income or poverty, and can really serve as a bellwether for higher need at the household level, such as a higher risk of poor health status and under-participation in the social welfare system. Moreover, food insecurity captures not only suboptimal household level resources, for example, income, but it also captures suboptimal consumption and consumption of a critical input at the household level, so food, basically. Suboptimal consumption of food can have particularly unique and adverse impacts on the experience of disability, potentially leading to a cyclical pattern of greater need for households with disabilities. Thus, taking an intersectional lens and focusing specifically on how households with disability access and participate in social welfare programs across food security status allows for a greater exploration of the idiosyncratic relationship between need, resources, and well-being. When it comes to addressing gaps in well-being, such as higher rates of food insecurity, households with disability are often facing two at-odds challenges. First, they require a higher level of financial resources in order to achieve an adequate standard of living as compared to households without disabilities. Secondly, they experience more barriers when trying to access social welfare programs that can help address this level of financial need. So this dual challenge can be interpreted through competing phenomena in the social welfare literature, and they are selection bias and administrative burden. Selection bias refers to the tendency of those with greater needs to participate in social welfare programs at higher rates than those with less need. I'm losing my notes a little bit here. Okay, there we go. And administrative burden refers to the procedures through which one must navigate in order to actually access, receive, and utilize the social welfare benefits. Although households with disability on average have a greater need for financial resources available through the social welfare system, they also experience greater and unique challenges in actually accessing those programs as compared to households without disabilities. So with these frameworks in mind, I look at two research questions. The first is, how does participation in the social welfare system differ for households with disability compared to households without disability? Based on the stylized fact that households with disability have higher needs for the financial benefits of social welfare programs, as well as the prior research finding that households with disability participate in the social welfare system at higher rates, I hypothesize that selection bias will result in low-income households with disabilities selecting into both individual and multiple social welfare programs at higher rates as compared to households without disabilities. My second research question asks whether participation rates differ when stratifying by household food security status. Due to the severity of need for households with disability compared to those without disability, selection bias may actually be masking some of the impact that administrative burden has on households as they're trying to access the social welfare system. So using food insecurity as a proxy for household level needs allows not only for the exploration of selection bias by comparing households with disability and households without disability with the same needs. So for example, with the same food security status. It also is going to allow me to examine administrative burden via the comparison of households with disability across varying levels of needs. So households with disabilities with very low food security, marginal food security, and high food security. We'll talk about that a little bit later. So in the first case, when holding food security constant and comparing between households with and without disabilities, if households with disabilities have equal or lower program participation than households without disabilities, then administrative burden to accessing programs could be overcoming the higher level of need that households with disability inherently have for selecting into program participation. In the second case, when holding disability constant, if selection bias is the stronger factor in program participation, we would expect to see participation rates decrease as the level of food security status increases. So we would expect program participation to decline as food insecurity, as houses became less food insecure. However, if administrative burden is a greater factor, then we might expect to see participation rates for higher levels of needs, such as very low and low food secure households. Participation rates may be equal or less than households with higher food security status. So those with higher levels of need are more readily able to participate in programs because their need is not as high. Their barriers to access are not as high. So we'll flesh out those two frameworks a little bit more as we move through the data and the methods. But first, let me kind of describe my setup. So this study uses data from the Survey of Income and Program Participation for years 2013 to 2019. The unit of analysis is at the household level. I limit the analytic sample to households with heads that are 18 or older, that have annual incomes less than 200% of the federal poverty line based on their household size, and that have at least one child that's less than 6 years old living in the household. I also weight all my analyses to the head of household. So I construct 4 binary measures of disability to look at. The first is functional disability, which is if any individual in a household reports serious difficulty seeing, hearing, concentrating, remembering, making decisions, walking or climbing stairs, dressing or bathing, or going outside of the home. The second is a work limiting disability, which is when any member of the household reports that their disability limits the kind or amount of work they're able to do, makes it difficult to find or keep a job, or prevents them from working altogether. I also look at child disability, which is when a member in the household reports that their dependent under the age of 18 has a developmental condition or delay that limits ordinary activity, has limited ability to play with other children the same age, or that limits the ability to do regular schoolwork. And finally, I construct an overall disability measure, which encapsulates functional, work limiting, or child disabilities. For food insecurity, for the stratification of food insecurity, I base that off of USDA's mutually exclusive food security statuses. Households are considered to have high food security if they have no reported indications of food access problems or limitations. Households are considered to be marginally food secure if they report 1 or 2 indications of food access problems, but little or no indication of change in diet. Marginal food security is when, no, I'm sorry, that was marginal food security. Very low food security is if households report reduced quality, variety, or desirability of diet, but do not actually reduce the overall food intake that they eat. And finally, food insecure, very low food secure households are when there are multiple indications of disrupted eating patterns and reduced food intake at the household level. So if you're familiar with any sort of food insecurity literature, food insecurity is often measured as a binary variable, but that binary variable is constructed from these food security statuses. So marginal and high food security are usually considered food secure, and very low and low food security are usually considered food insecure. So for the sake of this paper, trying to really tease out those differences in level of needs, I'm looking at the 4 categories as opposed to the binary food insecurity measure. And just for the sake of time in this presentation, I'm going to be primarily focusing my results on any disabilities, which again includes child, functional, and work limiting, but happy to talk through other results potentially if there's time. So for social welfare program participation, I consider 17 different programs, and they're listed here. Some of them are acronyms just for the sake of space. It's unemployment insurance, old age and survivors insurance, disability insurance, workers' comp, supplemental nutrition assistance program, women, infants, and children, which is a food supports program for young children. School food programs, so that includes both National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Programs, housing assistance, which includes both rent vouchers and rent subsidies, energy assistance, subsidized childcare, Medicaid, Medicare, supplemental security income, temporary aid to needy families, general assistance, veteran assistance, and the earned income tax credit. So when constructing my participation variables, I look at several different definitions of trying to operationalize participation. So the first is looking at any individual program participation rate. So for example, what % of households participate in unemployment insurance? I also look at the count of programs. So in any given household, how many different programs does the household participate in? And lastly, I look at multiple program participation as defined as 3 or more programs or 5 or more programs. Again, for the sake of time, I'm going to be primarily focusing on presenting the results for 5 or more programs in this presentation, mostly because 5 is the top coded number of programs for my count variable, but also because the 3 or more programs, the results are qualitatively similar. The patterns of participation rates are very similar across 3 or more programs and 5 or more programs. So I did want to make a note about the universe of program participation. So I consider rates of program participation for households that are ostensibly eligible for a given program and not for the overall population. So it's impossible for me to be certain that only eligible households are included in the construction of my analytic sample, but I do take a number of steps to try to ensure that most are. So first, I limit the sample to households that are less of 200% of the federal poverty line. This is a fairly standard cutoff when considering program eligibility for means tested programs. I also limit the household. I also limit my household to young children to ensure that eligibility for child-dependent programs, such as subsidized childcare, school food programs, and finally, SIP. The SIP data set assigns a missing value to households that are not asked a given question about program participation. This often, but not always, is due because their previous responses in the survey indicated that they're not eligible. So that helps a little bit too with making sure that who's in the analytic sample. So thus, I'm interpreting my participation rates to reflect participation in households that are eligible for a given program instead of participation rates for the whole population of the SIP survey. My methods are pretty straightforward. This is a descriptive paper. I estimate the proportion of households by disability status. And again, although I'm just focusing on any disability for this presentation, I also calculate for functional, child, and no disability. I'm sorry, functional, child, and work-limiting disability. I calculate each of the 17 social welfare program participation rates for each of the 17 social welfare programs that I listed on the previous slide. I estimate for participation in any programs. I estimate participation for no programs. I estimate the participation rate, the proportion of households that participate in 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 or more programs separately, and then again, multiple program participation of 3 or more. In addition to participation rates for each disability status, I also test whether there are significant differences between disability status. So specifically, I compare differences in proportions for households with disability to households without disability. I compare participation rates between households with disability, households without disability stratified by their food security status. So for example, households with disability and very low food secure status are compared to households without disability and very low food secure status. And finally, I compare rates within a single disability status, so stratified by food security. So households with any disability, comparing those with very low food security, low food security, marginal food security, high food security. Okay, so let's get into some results. So the first set of analysis of the full analytic sample finds that households with disabilities are participating in more social welfare programs than households without. Not a huge surprise. And remember that the analytic sample is already a very high need sample, being economically precarious, less than 200% of the federal poverty line, and having at least one child under the age of 6. So this suggests that selection bias is probably influencing the engagement in the social welfare system of households with disabilities due to their inherently higher needs. Since we would suspect that the full sample would be participating because of their economic cutoff. So almost 98% of households with disability participate in any programs in the social welfare system. And this is compared to about 94% of those without households with disability. So very high rate. But that difference is statistically significant. The number of programs that households with disability participate is also higher. So households with disability participate in a little over 4 programs on average, compared to those without disability who participate in a little bit over 3 programs. The distribution of participation rates across the count of programs is higher. So participation rates are highest in the 5 or more program categories for households with disability. And so just for clarification, over 40% of households with disabilities participate in 5 or more programs. Participation rates are highest in 3 or more programs for households without disability. So almost a quarter of households without disability, the majority of them are participating, not the majority, I'm sorry, the largest share of them are participating in 3 or more programs. So hopefully this will be a little clearer with this figure. This plots the participation rates for each mutually exclusive number of programs that households participate in. The kind of goldish colored bars represent households with any disability, while the blue bars represent households with no disability. And again, given the financial position of this analytic sample, it's not surprising that we see participation rates increase as the count of the number of programs rise for both households, at least up until 3 programs. And then starting with 4 programs, we see that rates begin to go back down for households without disability, but continue upwards for households with disabilities. And these 2 trend lines here represent the trends for households with disability and without. Again, the gold line represents households with any disability, while the blue trend line is households with no disability. And we can see here, it rises and then falls, whereas the households with any disability just continues upwards over the kind of the continuum of programs. So the first set of analyses for the first research question on the full analytic sample also finds that rates of participation in individual social welfare programs are higher for households with disabilities than those without disability, with a couple of exceptions. And since selection bias suggests that households with disabilities should be participating in higher rates for all programs, given their level of need. The exceptions for where households with disabilities are not participating more is leaving open the idea that perhaps other factors are at play, influencing access to participation beyond just the level of need. So the first thing we find is that households with disabilities have highest rates of participation in Medicaid, SNAP, and school food programs, while the lowest rates of participation are in workers' comp, general assistance, and veterans benefits. So to help visualize, we can see here that 87.58% of households with disability participate in Medicaid, 62.9% participate in SNAP, and 54.8% participate in school food programs. Again, that includes the National School Lunch Program and School Breakfast Program. Only 3.4% of households participate in veterans benefits. Households with disability participate in veterans benefits. 2.3% participate in general assistance, and 2.27% participate in workers' comp. Like households with disabilities, households without disabilities also participate at the highest rates in Medicaid. We see that up here. The blue line on top is households with no disabilities. But unlike households with disabilities, the lowest rates of participation are unsurprisingly for disability insurance. So only 0.03% of the analytic sample without a self-reported disability actually participate in disability insurance. So that gives us some confidence that people are reporting their participation correctly. So the next finding is that the biggest gap in participation between households with and without disability is for Medicare. Almost 98% of households, we can see here that the Medicare participation gap between households with and without disability. Medicare is the 6th highest participated program for households with disability, but it's one of the lower participated programs for households without disabilities. So that's kind of why that gap is so big. We see almost 25% of households with disability are participating in Medicare, whereas only 6% are of households without disability are participating. And finally, households with disability participate in the earned income tax credit at lower rates than households without disability. And they also participate at statistically equivalent rates in subsidized childcare. So just to highlight that, EITC has the fourth highest participation rate for households with disability, but it's actually the second largest for households without disability. The difference in their participation rates is about 4 percentage points, and is statistically significant. So that means that households without disability are significantly participating more in EITC than households without disability. Subsidized childcare is another exception for where households without disabilities are performing at similar rates to households with disabilities. As you can see, their percentages are very close. The difference is not significant. So kind of taken together, when we are expecting to see households with disabilities participating at higher rates across the social welfare system, the instances where they're not are some of the more interesting findings. So moving on to the second set of analyses that stratifies the sample by household food security status, I find once again that households with disabilities are participating in more social welfare programs than households without. But when comparing across food security status within households with disabilities, we're seeing that differences in participation by level of need are not necessarily linear and are not necessarily significant. So within households with disability, participation in any given program is relatively similar for households with very low food security and those with high food security. So put another way, 98% of households with any disability with very low food security are participating at 98%, whereas 97% of households with any disability but high food security are participating in the social welfare system. So that gap is much smaller than it was for households with and without disability, not stratified. We also see that within households with disability, households with disability and any degree of food insecurity, so with very low food security or with low food security or with marginal food security, that they're participating in a similar number of programs. So 4.4%, very low food secure households participate on average in 4.4 programs, whereas very low food secure households are participating in 4.2, and marginally food secure households are participating at 4.3. And again, this is just within households with disabilities. So we're not comparing to households without disabilities. So across level of need, presumably very low food secure households have a higher level of need. They're really not participating in more programs than a household that is marginally food secure, but with also disabilities. We do see a difference between households with disabilities and high food security. So 3.8 programs is the average number of programs that households with disabilities with high food security participate in. So we're not seeing a linear pattern. We're not seeing program participation declining kind of steadily or in a linear way as level of need decreases. And another finding from this kind of set of analyses is that households with disabilities with higher levels of need, so again, very low and low food secure status households, that they participate in 5 or more programs at equal or lower rates to households with lower levels of need. So to try to help illustrate that, we have this graph here. So we can see here that this top line is participation rates for 5 or more programs. So for households with very low food security, they're participating at about 46.7%. We do see a slight drop in very low food secure participation in 5 or more programs, but then it goes back up for households with that are marginally food secure. So again, we're kind of expecting to see that line go down over time, and we're seeing some variation across food security status. And similarly for 4 or more programs, low food secure, very low food secure, low food secure, and marginally food secure households with disabilities are participating. We do see that downward trend, but then we see it pick back up for households with high food security. So there's something about kind of these different categories of need that might be influencing the number of programs that people are participating in. So selection bias suggests that households with disability will participate at higher rates due to their higher level of need. So when we are looking at participation rates stratified by food security, which can be thought of as an added indicator of need in addition to a disability. The most interesting findings are those where there are lower rates of participation for households with disabilities. The first major finding from this set of analyses looking at specific individual programs is that households with disabilities and very low, and marginal food security under participate in the ITC compared to those without disabilities who have similar levels of need. And again, we also see similar under participation for subsidized childcare. So to try to illustrate this, we have a big table with lots of numbers, but the important ones here are highlighted in blue and starred. So the differences in EITC participation, bolded and highlighted here, is greatest when looking at households with very low food security. So under participation rates for households with very low food security and with disability are participating in EITC at about 10 percentage points lower than very low food secure households that don't have a disability. So we're in this set of analyses, we're comparing between households with disability and households without disability. We also see under participation for subsidized childcare compared to those without disability, but only for the very low food secure status. The results become insignificant or kind of flip signs for other food secure households. There we go. Okay. The next finding is that compared to the full analytic sample, when we stratify by food security status, we find many instances where participation becomes statistically equivalent between households with disability and households without disability, even when they have the same food security status. So if you recall, in the full analytic sample, households with disability were participating at significantly higher rates in almost all programs, with the exception of EITC. But when we classify by food insecurity, we see a lot of differences become null. So those are the ones here that are highlighted in yellow. I won't go through all of them, but participation rates do tend to equalize across levels of food insecurity for WIC and for WIC households who are participating in WIC and who are very low, marginal, and high food security. We also see housing become statistically insignificant for most of the food security categories, but not for low food secure households. So a little bit of a mystery there why it's equivalent across the other food secure statuses, but not kind of in this status that's in the middle. And lastly, one thing to note of this is there's not really a clear pattern in the equalization of participation rates across food security status. So we have equalization rates being highest in very low food security households, but then the next highest is high food security households. And then it switches back to low food security households. So we're not really seeing like this downward trend or this upward trend in any particular direction. So that may suggest that it's not so much about the food security status, but the particular nature of the programs themselves. Okay. So finally, looking specifically within households with disabilities, there are 5 programs in which participation rates are equivalent or lower for households with higher levels of need. So in other words, these are programs where households with low or very low food security are participating in rates that are lower than high or marginal food security. And again, just looking at households with disabilities, are households with higher levels of need participating at lower rates. And we do find this for 5 programs. For unemployment, old age, and survivors insurance and subsidized childcare, we see a linear increase in participation as food insecurity status increases. So in other words, as the level of need decreases, we actually see an increase in participation. So just to further clarify, that top row, UI insurance, 3.6% of households with disability who experience very low food security participate in UI, whereas households with disability with low food security participate at 4.2%, 4.02%. Marginal food security 6.7, and high food security 3.8. So we do see that little tick back down after marginal food security, but between the households that are actually experiencing kind of distress or food needs at the household level, we're seeing kind of the opposite relationship that we expect. So for EITC, the other programs, so for Veterans Assistance, EITC, the participation is not quite as linear. We kind of see it jumping all over the place. So that's a little bit harder to interpret than something like UI or childcare, where we just see an upward trend. Okay, so I know I'm running out of time, so I'm going to go quickly through the discussion. So what's going on? Is it selection bias? Is it administrative burden? We do see that households with disability are selecting into social welfare programs at higher rates. That's what we expected to see. That's what a few previous research papers have found. When we stratify by food security status, we see that this holds for the majority of programs, or for most programs, but not all programs. So the stratification of level of need offers several instances where selection bias is just not holding for households with disability. There's something else going on there. And I think that the framework of administrative burden and kind of the barriers to access can offer kind of an explanation for what might be going on with these particular programs. And it's probably some of both. It's not selection bias or administrative burden. It's a combination of the two. And so given that households with disability participate in some programs more but less than others, when considering their various level of needs, again, we can probably conclude that both are at play. And participation in individual programs may be influenced by one or the other. The social welfare system as a system is not a monolith. People engage differently depending on the type of program. So some limitations to subseen. These are correlational estimates. These are not cause and effect. We think selection bias is moving in a pathway where higher levels of need lead to higher participation, but administrative burden is higher level of need to lower participation, and it's further complicated by the actual causal impact of higher participation, potentially lowering the need at the household level. So want to throw it out there that I'm not trying to suggest that one thing is causing another, but just trying to illustrate what's happening at the household level. Additionally, these estimates are, again, they're just participation rates. And so beyond kind of the parameters that I include in my analytic samples of disability, poverty, child status, and food insecurity, these estimates are not controlling for other factors that could be influencing our understanding of participation. So I'm thinking demographics, age, race, gender, as well as differences in state generosity across different kind of welfare programs. So this is just a kind of part of this paper, I am planning on developing selection models that predict probability of selection into individual and multiple program participation. And within those, I'm really trying to think through how to kind of better capture some of these questions that these other factors that might be participating, that might be influencing participation, such as financial need, program barriers, as well as other household and state level factors to access. And that's it. So happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. And thank you for being on time. So we'll pass it over to Zach for some comments.
Great job, Lauren. Excellent job. I'll be very brief. I think what was really interesting to me about this paper is your theoretical framework, which I think is really an advancement and shows real insight for analyzing the adequacy of supports for people with disabilities across the welfare state. So the framework that you put forward is built on two key theoretical ideas. This idea of selection bias, which I wonder if there's a better way to describe that than using this selection bias, because I think it's a little confusing to the reader. But the key idea here is that people with disabilities have higher levels of need, even with the same amount of income, right? So unlike people without disabilities, people with disabilities must spend money on disability-specific items, right? They have a conversion disadvantage, right? The same amount of income does not translate into the same food security status because they have to spend money on these higher levels of need. And you talk about that in your paper. And so this acts a lot like tax that they must pay, and which restricts the ability to convert these resources into food security. So with that in mind, you're looking at selection bias with the assumption that the bias should exist, right? That people with disabilities should be more likely to enroll in programs, all else equal, controlling for other elements, right? All else equal, they should be selecting into these programs. I think that's a key, really interesting insight. And then the second key insight too, or theoretical idea is of administrative burdens, right? This idea that there are tremendous barriers to accessing benefits. I'm sure that comes as a surprise to nobody here, particularly for people with disabilities, and that people with disabilities, you cover in your paper, the literature on how people with disabilities in particular experience administrative burdens at a greater degree than people without disabilities. And so here the theory is that these higher burdens for people with disabilities should would reveal themselves if we saw that they did not receive social welfare benefits at the same level as people without disabilities. So I think your analysis is a lot like a detective. I'm much more interested in your programmatic comparison analyses than your number or count of program participation, because I think you really get an idea of how well these various programs in our piecemeal welfare state, really ad hoc, your list, it just shows how the variety of program knowledge you need to understand this complex system, right? But you can really be a detective here and think about how well is this system of social protection providing adequate standard of living for people with disabilities, in mind that people with disabilities have a selection bias, have higher needs than people without disabilities. So I think you test these claims with rich data from the SIP. And you use it's a very robust data exercise, maybe too robust for a journal article if you're thinking about publishing this in a journal form. I think I saw you presented the any disability indicator. I think that was good. You might want to just present, given that those different degrees disability indicators have very different participation restrictions that people have different. You might want to just restrict it to one of those disability indicators going forward. And you really do a careful analysis. A couple more comments. I think the EITC case is the most interesting finding here, right? Where this is I think one of the real strengths of the paper is that you're able to drill down on these programmatic differences, right? So the selection bias for EITC is interesting. And you suggest that this might result from administrative burdens, which I think is feasible, particularly because tax filing is the primary means in which people get EITC. And I can imagine, and I wonder if you could cite even research here showing barriers to tax filing for people with disabilities and lower tax filing. I think that would really add to that explanatory suggestion. But I also wondered if there are other factors that might explain this, such as different work rates among people with and without disabilities with the same income. I also thought, you do a very good job creating a very careful analytic sample, allowing for comparison of all households with incomes below 200% of the federal poverty line with a young child present. So that's your kind of your controls in your model. You could say you've sort of created those through your analytic sample. But I wonder if a regression controlling for other factors like age, race, geographic status, even income, because at the 200% of the federal poverty line, there's probably still a lot of income variation in that population. So even controlling for those factors and looking at these differences in SNAP, EITC, remain in that regression framework, I think would be interesting. And if they do remain, that even bolsters your claim of administrative burden, identifying administrative burden. I think, it's looking at the disability, people on SSDI with and without disabilities. DI is a program for people with disabilities, and Medicare is largely, especially among working age people, is a program for people with disabilities. So, which your population mostly is, I believe, is as of working age. Those programmatic differences, I'd like to see more. Thinking about how these program-specific features interact with participation. Without that, I'm really excited to hear other people's questions, and a great job on this paper, and I'm excited to see where it goes forward.
Thank you very much, Zach, for your comments. Lauren, would you like to respond to any of the comments before we open up?
Yeah, no, I really appreciate that feedback. It always feels really nice to hear someone repeat back to you what you think you're saying, and it's coming across in the way you're trying to say it. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and I hear your point about disability insurance and some of the other kind of programs that people may not be eligible for, but I'm still kind of including in this system. And I do think that I have experienced some tension at times of really wanting to give a whole picture of the entire social safety net, but recognizing that not everybody is equally involved in the social safety net or in the social welfare system to the same degree. So I recognize that tension. I feel like I appreciate you bringing that to my kind of to the forefront, and I should talk about that tension more in my paper. And then to your point about the regression models, I think that is exactly what I'm trying to do in my selection models, and I wish that I had those more ready to share today. But I will take that feedback and incorporate into those.
Okay, so let's open up for more comments and as well as questions. Anyone wants to jump in?
Yeah.
Robin?
Yes, hi. My career has been in aging, so I'm very interested in the participation rate of older persons. And I also realized, disability, you may be talking about disability, people born living a life of disability, but over time now with aging, people are being considered disabled. And when you're talking about these programs, I mean, I was actually at the Department for the Aging, so I know well about these various programs, right? And the challenges of accessing. And it says to me, we're talking about people having case managers who, because who knows about these services that are out there, and the case managers being the ones to introduce them to the various services, et cetera, So I was actually just wondering in those families, if you, and again, just hearing about dissecting the information, the data by age, if you had any kind of handle on older person's participation. And by older, so in aging, it should be 60 and up, but I realize in disability, you could be talking 50 and up, So do you have any information on that?
No, I actually have not run the analyses separately for particular age groups. It's one of those things where I would love to run it so many different ways. And my advisor is like, you can only run it one way if you ever want to graduate. So, but I really take your point, and I think that it's a different set of kind of like challenges and different set of programs, and I think it would be really interesting to kind of kind of redo this analysis with the focus being on households that have older, kind of older disabilities. I don't know if that's the right term. Older people with a disability.
Yeah, but it is about graduating, so I very much appreciate that.
All right, thank you. Any other comment or question?
I have one. So Lauren, thank you very much. That was really, really interesting. I think I learned a lot from the presentation. One of the things that I was kind of curious about is how you're thinking about the selection into the program. So it sounded to me like you're talking about how households with disabilities, and you're comparing them to households without disabilities, and finding that households with disabilities are enrolling in more of these programs, and therefore that's sort of consistent with the idea that households with disabilities are negatively selected relative to households without disabilities for program participation. And that makes a lot of sense to me, but I think you yourself during the presentation at some point said maybe that's to be expected. That kind of makes a lot of sense. They're more likely to be eligible for these programs. They're more likely to have needs that the programs can meet in many different ways. So I was wondering if you've thought about an alternative way of thinking about selection bias here, which is let's take two households with disabilities. So comparing a household with disabilities to another household with disabilities, looking at one of the households enrolls in a social welfare program, the other household does not enroll in a social welfare program, and comparing differences in the characteristics, perhaps food security, between those two households to sort of try to understand within the category of households with disabilities, is there any evidence of negative selection? I'll share with you an article that I read a couple of years ago in economics, looking at SNAP enrollment. I just dropped it in the chat. The authors ran an experiment in which they provided some information to households that they thought were SNAP eligible about the program, and found that households that responded to that information were more positive in several dimensions than the households that had been participating before, which is consistent with a negative selection story. Anyway, so that was a lot, but I wonder if you've thought about an alternative way of thinking about the selection bias point that you made.
Yeah, no, I haven't thought of it from that angle, and I think that's a really interesting angle. When I first started thinking about kind of this topic, just a little bit of background. I primarily have worked in food insecurity, so I kind of came to this research question is like, how does the social welfare system impact food insecurity? And kind of through the process of developing this research question, it almost got flipped. The question in my mind got flipped. It's not so much how, or the question I'm asking isn't so much of like how it's affecting these outcomes, but I do think that that's a really interesting kind of framing, and I would love to kind of explore that paper more and kind of flesh it out, like incorporate and flesh out more. Because I do, I appreciate you all bearing with me. This is the first time I'm like presenting these results, so I'm still trying to like work through what it is exactly that I'm trying to interpret. So these suggestions are really helpful, and I appreciate that.
Awesome. It looks like it's in a really great place. Thank you very much, Lauren.
Any other question or comment? No, so maybe I'll follow up. I think, I mean, the comments I had were brought up before, but yeah, I was wondering about SNAP, given that SNAP aims to address food insecurity. So perhaps, I mean, it would be very interesting to have a little bit of a zooming in on that program. And yes, about selection bias, I was wondering if perhaps you're thinking of uptake of program participation rather than selection bias, and maybe something to reconsider. It might be that in another paper your selection bias becomes central, but I didn't think of what you were doing as documenting selection bias. I thought we were documenting the uptake of social welfare programs. Yeah. Thank you so much. Do we have other, maybe a quick comment or question? No? All right. So would you like to respond to any of the comments, Lauren?
I just thank you for coming and for offering some feedback. It was really helpful to to talk it out and hear kind of how it was coming across to others, to make sure that I'm interpreting things the way that I think I am, and kind of the areas where I need to focus in a little bit more. So I appreciate that, and all the other suggestions.
Well, thank you for sharing your work, and thank you, Lauren, and thank you, Zach, for giving your comments. Thank you all for being here.